It's really a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the SMU campus. Many of you have been here before. Some of you, it might be your first visit to SMU. My name is Jim Hollifield, and I am the director of the Tower Center. I see that our logo is up there, but we've actually changed our name. We used to be a Center for Political Studies. Now we're a Center for Public and International Affairs, which sort of represents a much broader mission for the center. And I was going to say, I don't know how many of you in here are from Dallas, but what a difference a day or two makes. I mean, the weather is gorgeous out there. So some of you might have had to drive around or through fallen trees or rubble to get here. I know the traffic has been tough, so we're pleased that you're here. And I was wondering how many people would show up in the middle of the day like this for the beginning of a program on a weekday. But I guess there's nothing much going on in the Middle East now or in South Asia. So we're probably not going to have too much to talk about. But I know you're here to hear from the people that we have invited to this program. And we're going to be talking about this book. I don't know if we're going to have copies of the book available, but the book is out. I was looking at it. It sounds like something out of an old Western to me, you know, the last card, playing the last card. So that's what we're going to talk about. And we've got players, the people who were involved in making the decision to surge troops into Afghanistan and Iraq. So we have some of the most critical players here with us today. We're going to mix them with scholars. Some of the scholars, I see Peter Feaver sitting in the back, some of the scholars were actually players themselves in this. And I hope Richard Emmerman doesn't mind, but I overheard him at lunch today saying the historians who are here, when they start mixing with political scientists, it's like going over to the dark side. Is that what you said, Richard? So we're going to mix very contemporary discussions about politics and international affairs and foreign policy, but we're going to do it historically. This is part of a project called Collective Memory, which started with the Bush Institute and School, the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. I'm told 28 interviews, 1,400 pages, and 200 hours of video. So this is really oral, diplomatic history at its best. So we're going to move from sort of mission accomplished, you remember that banner on the aircraft carrier, to talking about the surge of troops to try to rescue the situation in both Afghanistan and Iraq. I'm just going to say a few more words about the collaborators on this project. I think you can see them in the program, the Center for Presidential History and the Tower Center here at SMU. We're the hosts for this. Jeff Engel, who's the classic Jeffrey, he has gone down to KERA Studios to film the show Think with Chris Boyd about this project, and he was joined by Will Bowden. Will, if you don't know, is another great historian who directs the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas at Austin. We have a Duke contingent here. I see we have a lot of people from SAIS, from Johns Hopkins. We have some UVA people here, and we have at least one person from Harvard. So these are the institutions that have participated in this project and contributed to the book. I would be remiss if I didn't recognize my great friend and colleague, the best president of the best World Affairs Council in the United States. I know we got a lot of World Affairs Council members here. Jim Falk, very, very grateful to Jim for his help with this. So as I said, we've got the players, including Stephen Hadley, who will be speaking tonight, a truly great public servant who was the director of the NSC under Bush. And I say public servant in days when that meant something and it really mattered, and we respected people who hold these high positions. So we're going to look forward to hearing from him tonight. And I think now, without even leaving the stage, I'm going to get the first panel underway so we can start this. And as a college professor, I would say get your notepads out. You're going to be questions, discussion. So we're going to start with our first panel. And I want to invite the panelists to come up to the stage. Tim Sayle from the University of Toronto, who was here at SMU as a postdoc. He's going to, come on up, Tim. He is going to chair the panel and lead a discussion about this. He works on, among other things, NATO. I think that NATO has been in the news quite a bit, so make a note of that. Meghan O'Sullivan, who is the Kirkpatrick Professor in the Kennedy School at Harvard, an expert on North America, among other things, and one of the officials of the Trilateral Commission, and also former member of the Bush National Security Council. And finally, of course, Peter Feaver. Happy to welcome Peter back to SMU and to the Hilltop. Peter is a professor at Duke, the director of the Grand Strategy Program, also a former White House official, NSC person in the Bush administration. So if you all wouldn't mind joining me in giving a big round of welcome for our panelists. Tim?
Thanks very much, Jim, for that warm invitation. It's a pleasure to be back here, and it's a pleasure to be on stage with one of the interview teams and also some of the policymakers from the surge decision. So the three of us spend a lot of time asking questions of others, and so it's my pleasure to ask you some questions today. As we moved around the country interviewing all of the 28 people that are interviewed for the book, we often began with the question, how did the surge story begin for you? And we asked interviewees to sort of set the stage with when they started thinking about what we would come to know as the surge. I want to ask you a variation on that question, which is sort of the origin story of this project itself. Where did this project come from?
So I will observe that when we did the interviews, we ran into a lot of people who had come up with the idea of the surge. This is one of the phenomenon that success has 1,000 parents. And I was not one who could lay claim to having come up with the idea for the surge, but I will lay claim to having come up with the idea for this project. And it actually grew out of work that I did as a graduate student on the oral history of permissive action links, which was a device that protected nuclear weapons from unauthorized use that was invented in the late 50s, early 60s. And as Harvard was preparing to do the oral history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they wanted to pioneer the technique within a smaller project, and so they asked me and another person to do that on PALs. And PALs were a great idea that turned out to have about 4 or 5 people who had invented the idea and had been telling their grandchildren for decades that they had invented permissive action links. And it wasn't until we had interviewed them and brought them on stage together that they discovered they weren't the only ones. And it turned into an almost comical exchange when we brought them all together. And I said to Meghan, I said, there were so many consequential decisions that the Bush administration made. It would be interesting to do the same kind of study of Bush administration decisions, where we would interview folks separately to see their individual role and then bring them together collectively to see how the roles fit together. And Meghan said, great idea. We thought this would be really easy to pull off, and we'd start with an easy one, the surge. And then we'd have so much momentum, we'd just do one after the other. Well, it turned out a little more difficult to pull off than we had expected, and it's taken longer than we thought. But I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish at the end. That's how the project started for me. Meghan, what would you add?
Well, I would just confirm your thesis that everybody believes it begins with them. So I think that's a good sign. No, you and I had that conversation and agreed on this, and this was maybe 8 years ago, something like that. When I left the government in 2008, I started teaching a class at Harvard, which was trying to teach my students how national security decision-making happens in the US government. And I structured a course that was around 15 decisions based on Iraq. So a deep dive into 15 decisions. The surge was one of them. And so I felt like this would be something that would be useful to try to dig into each of these decisions in the way that Peter said. So it is a meeting of minds around some useful projects we might do. And like Peter, this is, it's not exactly how I expected it would all unfold, but I am very glad that so many people devoted so much time and energy to putting this together in something that I think will have some real historical import.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and success, can have 1,000 parents, and so we have lots of claims. And it was interesting how that balanced in our conversations with people learning where their role fit in the broader scheme of the decision making. So one question I want to ask you both, your resources for the project, and that you were able to tell us about what was happening within your office or within the White House, but we also learned about different levels of compartmentalization, different initiatives in different parts of government. Was there anything new for you in this project? What did you learn as we went through these interviews and pulled them all together?
Well, the honest answer is not the best answer. I learned that I have a face for radio is what I learned, because the original plan was we were just going to do interviews and not. That's what Meghan and I thought, and the important piece that Jeff and SMU added was, let's make it a video record of people's interviews, which will then make it more useful for other scholars, but also as a teaching tool for other colleges and courses. And I think in hindsight, Jeff was right. That does magnify its use and its reach. But it made the whole process so much more complicated. And there were some really amazing moments when we realized we needed to travel all the way to Jackson Hole, remember, to interview Vice President Cheney, and we thought we had an agreement to do the interview, and it wasn't until we were all sitting there that we had to renegotiate that agreement. And I was already not looking forward to submitting my travel claim for the hotel that I was staying at, and if I had nothing to show for it. So I learned that doing an interview on video does change the dynamic of the person that you're interviewing, and makes it harder for them to sort of say something, and then as they're saying, realize, oh, no, that's not what I meant. I meant something else. And when you do a written interview, as is done at the Miller Center, Mills here, and they do that, you get a chance to fix those, because you realize 5 minutes after you've said it that, no, I thought that was in October, but now I realize that was really in November. When you're doing it in a video, you can't do that, and that makes people more cautious, maybe. And so there's a pro and con. My solution to that was that we would give everyone the option to say something off camera afterwards. And occasionally we learned something from those sessions, but that was not a perfect fix for this challenge.
Let me add two things. First, I think your question might have been about, did we learn anything about the process that we didn't know? And certainly there are things that were new to me in reading the accounts and doing the interviews. But I would say my larger takeaway on the whole was that we at the NSC had remarkable visibility over what was going on. So there weren't any big shocks or surprises to me, and that, in fact, was a surprise in itself. which again doesn't mean that we knew everything that was going on. The Council of Colonels, which now has become fairly well known, I was not aware that that was going on at the time. I did learn about it subsequent to the decision of the surge, but we saw what came out of the Pentagon was more what came up through official channels. But I do think it underscores the point and the value of oral histories, because everything was embedded in a constant conversation. People in this room, I look out and I think about, the endless numbers of phone calls, hallway conversations, emails. I mean, there was a constant conversation going on with people working 16 to 18 hours a day. And so there was a lot of visibility over what we're doing. And I think the people who were working on this issue from every agency, that we had some really good relationships there. And there was a lot of sharing. So I think that was good. In terms of learning a little bit about this process, one of my regrets, of course, is that we didn't do this earlier. And I think that's a pretty common regret, but it made me think about, as a policymaker, did I ever for a minute think about, well, how will historians look at this later? And is there something I could do for historians that would make this more transparent later on? And I have to confess that did not cross my mind. But I think were I ever to be in a position again as a policymaker, that it is definitely something worth thinking about. I know in the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq, where I spent a little bit more than a year, we did have a resident historian. I was trying to remember his name. It's Gordon. I don't remember his last name, but he was someone who I don't think really got the time and attention of people, because it really felt like everything was pressing, everything was pressing. But in retrospect, I think having those people there at that time, it's worth trying to prioritize that a little bit more so that we can capture people's insights and thoughts and feelings, but not do it a decade later, which is what we ended up doing.
Thank you. On the issue of the video transcripts, or the videos and then the transcripts themselves, I should say that they're all now available on the CPH website. So people can watch these videos and read the transcripts. Some of them have been annotated with footnotes to correct wrong dates, so there's some catch for that. But we've made this material available for teaching and for scholarship. But of course, in academia, this comes with the secondary question, well, when are you going to get the documents? What about the primary sources? So we have this oral history collection, and in some ways, the oral histories let us capture some of that constant conversation, or at least to know there's a conversation occurring outside of the written record. But I'm curious, you both wrote a lot of memos in government. What will change in the surge story when the primary documents are released? Will the story change, do you think?
I was going to suggest just that. Yes. So that's a great question, Tim, and I'm excited for the day the documents are public, because I do think that they will help really flesh out this story. A lot of official government documents might be a little less revealing than I think the surge documents will be, because many official documents are the product of, as those of us who've been in government know, this long clearance process and people trying to forge consensus and put forward consensus views. There's some of that in the surge policy, but a lot of the surge documents, especially when it got to the level of the president, were actually written to try to clarify different positions and different options, and to clarify those differences and the consequences of them, and to move those to the president. So I think it will be useful. There are two things that I hope come out of it that I think are still part of the conversation or the emerging narrative around the surge. The first is, and this shows up in the book quite a bit, the idea that the president's decision was a gamble. That phrase, I think, suggests that, and there was a lot in the book and even in some of the interviews, that there were two options, withdraw or double down, and basically the president didn't like the first, so he went for the second. I really don't think that's a representation of what happened, and the complexity of the decision, I think, the process is very difficult to capture, even in multiple interviews. And I think the documents will show that President Bush's decision to go with the surge was really the product of some deep analysis, right? That it wasn't that he didn't like the alternative, so he decided on the surge, and then there was all this effort to sort of create a justification for it. It very much was a project of analysis. What are the dynamics on the ground in Iraq? How have they changed from when we made our first strategy? And what are those dynamics? And what are our abilities to affect those dynamics? And I personally, how I was seeing it at the time was that the violence, which appeared to many as a civil war, that violence appeared to me to be two extremist groups, largely Sunni and Shia, stoking violence among a broader population. And if that analysis was right, if we could get at those two extremist groups, we could deflate the widespread violence very quickly. However, if the violence was a product of historical animosities and was not being stoked by external extremist groups, then that solution wasn't going to work. And it turned out it was the first, and we did see this dramatic deflation of violence in the fall of 2007. So I guess, again, my point is not that President Bush was just saying, I refuse to accept the option of defeat, and therefore I'm going for the alternative. It really, and the papers will show this, there was a very, very extensive process to look at the drivers of the conflict, to look at how they might be changed, what our capabilities were, what the Iraqis' capabilities were. And so I think while we certainly couldn't know the outcome, I think we could feel confident that the strategy was based on more than a gamble. The second thing, and I'll make this very brief, and Peter may have more to say on this as well, I think naturally a lot of the focus has been on the military component of the surge. This is true, and the book gets a lot of attention, and some people have even gone so far as to say there wasn't a strategy. I think that what people will find when they see the documents is there's a lot more attention than has been revealed thus far on the political dynamics, even on the diplomatic side, on the economic dynamics, on the, changing our own structure, our bureaucracy, all of these pieces that came together with the military piece to be a strategy were there. They're just less glamorous, less visible, and I think someone who's really looking over those documents will be able to see this with much more clarity.
So one of the things that Meghan and I hoped we'd be able to do is get more of the documents released in time to be used in this. We got some, but not as many as we hoped. I do believe that some of those will be revealing. So I was struck by my memory of what the document said was different from, say, someone I was interviewing, their memory of what the document said. And I was pretty sure I was right, but the person I was interviewing thought it was something different. I thought, well, we got to wait until the document comes out to see which of us has the better memory of it. I also think that if I could wave a magic wand and release just one of the documents 3 years ago in time, to be chewed on for this project, it would be the state memo, which was when Steve Hadley convened the separate strategy reviews that had been done in the different departments into an interagency one chaired by J.D. Crouch. At that moment, we were trying to figure out as a interagency combined what are the options we're presenting to the president. And there was an option coming from the JCS. There was an option coming from the State Department, and it was a very powerfully written memo that Phil Zellicoe and David Satterfield, David Satterfield had written, that proposed a very dramatic change in strategy, change in mission set, change in goals, really. And we spent a lot of time as a collective wrestling with this option. This was a serious one. State Department, very powerful player in the interagency. It wasn't a random thought out there. The interviews did not wrestle with that memo as much as they should have, and as a consequence, I think the academic essays at the back of the book did not wrestle with that memo adequately. But I think doing so would be crucial for the presentist goal of understanding what it's like to make policy when you don't know what the outcome's going to be. Knowing that the president chose the surge, knowing that it worked out so much better than the critics thought it would, makes that whole line seem more inevitable than it did at the time. And wrestling more faithfully with what the options were as we thought they were, as the protagonists in the strategy review were arguing for, that would be more useful for lessons learned kinds of studies. So I look forward to that. Selfishly, I do hope that one of the memos I wrote finally gets out, because it was this was after the president has more or less decided on it, and Steve asked me to, what could go wrong? So red team the decision. And I came up with a list of, 12 things or something that could go wrong. And then the idea was task the interagency to address each one of these. And as we were addressing each one of these, about 3 or 4 of them happened over the course of the next 6 months, and I thought, this may not work out, and the baby may die in the cradle kind of moment. Fortunately, the team, David Petraeus and Ambassador Crocker and Doug Lute and everybody else, were more adept at dealing with these situations as they arose. But I feel like, as an analytic product, I rarely guess correctly, but there was a time when I guessed correctly about 3 or 4 things that could happen. And so, for my grandchildren, I hope that one sees the light of day one day.
Well, if I could sum up what you're both saying, it's that we need more historians. That's what I hear, right? This is a pro-history argument. That's excellent. So there is more work for historians to do, and that raises my next question. Peter, you alluded to the academic section of the book. We sometimes called it the scholarly section. So the book is divided in 2, essentially, with an oral history component at the beginning, policymakers on record, and then scholars examining this. But I think the chapter that you wrote with Mr. Hadley shows that this is sort of a blurry distinction between policy and scholarship, and you both are great examples of this. You have incredible academic training. We heard about your academic careers, but also this policy experience. So could you talk about how we bridge that gap, whether we should bridge that gap, what academics, scholars can bring to policy making, and what policymakers can bring to academia?
So I thought that one of the most revealing moments in the project was a statement made by Dick Betts, who's a dear friend, a really distinguished scholar at Columbia, civil military relations, among many other things. He's really one of the giants in my personal area of field of study. And we were at workshopping his chapter, and he and I were arguing over, a statement or something, and he revealed how much of a struggle it was for him to wrestle with these issues, in part because he had been himself shaped as a scholar in the wake of the Vietnam War. He was one of the first generation of security studies scholars just as the Vietnam War is ending, mid-late 70s. And of course, he had been one of the most prominent critics of the decision to invade Iraq, signed the academic letter, et cetera. So he was telling me, emotionally invested in the Iraq war debate on one side of it. And in some ways, now I'm projecting, he didn't say this, but as I heard him, I thought, you're as much invested in a particular narrative of Iraq as any of the policymakers who had worked on the issue. And I realized that the design of the project was built on an assumption that probably wasn't true, namely that there were policymakers who were biased because they had worked on the issue and thus had insights, but you had to recognize that they had a skew, and so you had to filter what they said in light of their obvious professional bias. on the one hand. And then there were scholars who were objective truth seekers who could stand apart from it, separate from it, and evaluate what the biased policymakers had said. And I realized in that workshop that actually it was probably easier for the policymakers to be candid about ways that they had called it wrong at the time. It seemed to me in our interviews, many of the policymakers found it easier to have some self-awareness and admit where they got wrong. And it was harder for the academics to. And in particular, if you had gone on record saying that the decision to invade Iraq was bad, or more to the point, if you had gone on record saying the decision to surge is a mistake, and so many of the academics who had opposed the Iraq war also vocally, actively opposed the surge and said it was a mistake, it was very hard for those academics to then step back and say, you know what, maybe the surge was a better idea than I realized, and so to develop that objectivity. And this is, of course, a question for my friends on the academic panel later this afternoon. How, am I overstating this case? I might be, I don't know. But I do think that there is this, at least on an issue like the Iraq war, where it's become so politicized in the academy, it's likely that there's not an objective perspective. Everybody has a stake, and so that's an important difference. The other difference, of course, is something that historians know very well, political scientists ignore more regularly, and that is the human element to the context of a decision. By which I mean these are human beings making the decisions with all of the strengths and weaknesses that human relations produce. Meghan mentioned it just in passing, but I want to emphasize it here. One reason that the surge strategy emerged was because of the trust that Steve Hadley was able to cultivate across the team. And of course, Steve is going to say it wasn't him, it was the president who was the primary trust generating engine, but I think that's right. But Steve was, I give Steve a lot of credit for growing the trust to be candid in the way we had to be. Because what we were talking about was the possibility that the most important project that the president was engaged in might not succeed. That is a very hard thing to talk about inside a White House. And to have that, the freedom to do that and to wrestle with alternatives requires a lot of trust. And requires that the person you're talking to is not going to be writing a memoir that's going to shiv you in the back and make you look like a fool. And so there's one time, I can vividly recall it, Steve was about to say something, he looked at me and said, "You better not be writing a book about this thing." I ended up writing something about it, but I didn't do it in a way that was sticking a shiv in someone. That's the human element. But if you did not have that, if you did not have that level of trust, then I think certain policy options might not have survived long enough to be incubated to the point where they would work. And so I give credit, I think Steve was great. Meghan was really wonderful about allowing other people like outside of her office to work in it. And I'll give one last shout out on the human element was Brett McGurk, who did not get nearly as much credit in the contemporaneous accounts, the Bob Woodward and other, early journalist accounts. We now know what a great public servant Brett has been across several administrations, but he was tireless on this issue at the time, and many others I could mention. So the human element is really important. Political scientists abstract all of that out and produce a number. This is a 7, okay, but that loses all of the human development. Historians are better about capturing that.
So at the risk of no, not disagreeing, continuing on this question, but I think it is actually at the heart of this project, the difference between policymakers and academics. So let me just add to what Peter said. I was struck in the course of this project, but also reading the final product, about something that I had realized earlier on in my career when I was working on the issue of sanctions. This is before I went into government and I was a fellow at the Brookings Institution. I realized that you had academics who kept saying sanctions don't work, and you had policymakers that kept using sanctions with abandon. And I thought, like, what explains this? And I realized policymakers and academics are just asking different questions. They're interested in different questions. And I think that this project reveals that in some fashion. As a policymaker, or at the time, the question that I was interested in, and am still interested in, was this process, did this process provide advice and recommendations in a decision that was the best one open to the president at that time? That's what I'm interested in. I think, as we see in many of the academic chapters, which were really useful and interesting, there's a lot of other questions at play. And one of the things that I think animates a lot of the scholarly take on it is, how does this process compare to some kind of ideal? And again, I think as a policymaker, you're much less interested in that, because you realize, well, there's no one ideal that works in every circumstance. And if you're asking the question I'm asking, does this process produce the best decision for this president at this moment, you realize that the process is going to differ from presidents to presidents. And let me just give you one example of what I'm talking about. There's a lot of talk, not just in this book and in the project, but in general in the foreign policy community, about the importance of the honest broker role of the National Security Advisor. And Brent Scowcroft is rightly kind of he embodies that idea of the honest broker. And when I think about this particular moment in history, this surge process, I think Steve Hadley played that role of the honest broker, but that wouldn't have been enough. If he had only played the role of honest broker, we wouldn't have gotten to where we got to. And this is another topic we could talk about, but I think something that is not maybe elucidated enough in the book is how where we got to with the surge compares to the alternatives. So you might still have quibbles over the surge, but we have to ask, how does it compare to the alternatives? So going back to Steve's role, I think he very, very adeptly managed to play that role of honest broker, in the sense that the president had access and was aware of all of the views and opinions and recommendations of everyone in his national security team. So he had that awareness, and Steve made sure that was the case. But Steve also played additional roles. He played the role of being an advisor, and he played the role of helping the president, after that decision had been made, to ensure that the government was actually going to be in a position to implement the change in strategy. And so being an honest broker was essential, but it wasn't enough in this case. And I think a lot of academics would disagree with that, based on the idea that the honest broker is the entirety of the job of the National Security Advisor. So it's a shout out to Steve for managing an incredibly complex process in such a professional and gracious way. But it's also an example of how some academics might be looking at, was the national security advisor playing this role of the honest broker, but me as a participant and as a policymaker, I'm much more interested in, is the national security advisor, one, making sure the president has all the information that he needs to make a good decision, and two, providing advice to the president at a very lonely and dark moment. And three, making sure that any decision made by the president actually can be implemented.
I'm going to turn to the floor in a moment for questions, and we do have microphones if people would like to ask Meghan and Peter questions. But let me ask one final question before we open it up. I think it's appropriate here on a university campus, and thanks very much to the Tower Center and obviously the Center for Presidential History. My question is about presidential power. It's one of these abstractions, I think, that you mentioned, Peter. Another person who crossed between academia and the policy world, Richard Newstead, famously said that the power of the president is the power to persuade. And I think we see that in this book. We see at times where the president understands that his comments or questions might shape policy options that are presented to him, and so he stays back from the process at certain times. Other times he decides it's the right moment to persuade. He goes famously to the tank to meet with the Joint Chiefs and others. So for those of us who have not worked for a president, and I understand actually the balance in this room maybe tilts for the one time to people who have worked for a president, but for those of us who haven't, can you talk about what it's like to work in that environment, how important the individual of the president, whoever is serving as president, is to that exercise of presidential power, how you saw it exercised in this time, what it means to work for a president, essentially?
Meghan worked for a president much longer than I did. This is something that I've thought a lot about, obviously, since I've come back, and also reading the daily newspapers, in the last several years. I had the privilege of working for two presidents. President Clinton, I was a very junior NSC staffer early on in his administration, and then somewhat more senior in the Bush administration. And they were very different personalities, and your interactions with them, at least my interactions with them, were very different. I had less access, obviously, than Meghan or certainly than Steve had to President Bush. But particularly with President Bush, the overwhelming impression I had was how different he was from the cartoon caricature that my academic friends back at Duke held of him. Their version of him was not smart, not thoughtful, not well-read, inarticulate, and reflexive, sort of making impetuous decisions. And that was not the person that I saw. I saw someone who was deeply committed to the integrity of the office of the president, and the notion that he was a custodian of something greater than himself, that he was temporarily a steward of, but then he had to hand on to the next person, and he had to make sure that he left the next person better off than he had been, and that was the job of the president, to leave the next person off better off if he could. There was, I'm not saying that he didn't make mistakes. Of course he made mistakes, but there was a commitment to something that was greater than just his own legacy, his own standing, his own the way people thought of him, and that was inspiring. He also was so much smarter than people gave him credit for. I'll never forget one day he came to the NSC to give an all-hands meeting, and this is the piece that few people realize. Many people work at the White House and never ever see the president. Right? They're working at a level where they don't have interaction, and that was my role in the Clinton administration. So one of my jobs was to always beg for opportunities to at least be in the same room with the president, and so this was a moment in the Bush administration where the president came and spoke to everybody at the NSC, and most of them, this was their first time in the room with the president. And he went around the world with no notes, just went around the world and said, here's what I'm trying to do in Southeast Asia. Here's what I'm trying to do in Qatar. Here's what I'm trying to do in Latin America. And my job in strategic planning was to be able to see the big picture and to try to see how the different pieces fit. I could not have done as good a job as he did in the 30,000 foot and then the granular in regions. And I realized this president knows so much more than and about the guts of what he's trying to do than my academic friends would believe. And I do think that causes staff to be loyal up. And so the Bush administration has, the team still has a high degree of camaraderie. And we just got together a couple weeks ago for a reunion, and it was striking to see the level of camaraderie. And this is the last point I'll say. My friends say, "What do you miss most about working in D.C.?" And I say it's the teamwork, the sense that you are all working on something that's bigger than yourself, that matters. In academia, you're mostly working on yourself. And in government, you have a chance to work for something bigger. So that is something that the president, I think, conveyed well.
So I agree with everything that Peter said, and certainly that's my impression and memory of the president, without a doubt. So I'll be very brief, but to add one more thing, and I think it gets to the heart of your question, which is about the president, and not just the president, but anyone in authority, and their ability to affect the information that comes to them by just a minute gesture. And President Bush talks about this in his interview, about how he was conscious of that. And I thought a lot about this during my time in the White House, because I would watch how carefully I watched the president, and not just his explicit verbal direction to me, but I was one of those people, when I would walk into the Oval Office, if I was pre-briefing the president before a phone call or a meeting, I would look for every cue in the room to see how much time I actually had. Did I actually have 2 minutes, or maybe did I have 10 minutes? And I would rely on all kinds of things, like, what kind of shoes is he wearing? He's in a better mood if he's wearing cowboy boots, I have longer. If the vice president's in the room, maybe there's other things going on, I have shorter. So you're constantly looking for cues. And I think that's part of being an effective person in government. But the downside can be that if you're a president, any joke, muttering under the breath, could actually shape what you get in your next briefing, or what people give you, because there is that natural desire to please the president. And so, I do think the president was very conscious of that. And I would say, and I'll sort of end here, but I would say that he explicitly, made it clear to me that he was open to me telling him things that he didn't want to hear. So when I left the White House, I got this wonderful CD with about 400 pictures of me with the president over the years that I was there. And my mother's flipping through it, and she said, "Why is he making that face at you in almost all of these photos?" And I said, "Because I'm giving him bad news in every single one of these photographs." And that was true. And actually, when we come to the surge decision, I remember a moment, and I think he may have said this to others, but it weighed on me very heavily. I still think about it. He said to me, "Meghan, I'm looking to you to tell me how we can change the trajectory in Iraq, but I'm also looking to you to tell me if we can't." And that's a big idea. He was saying, I want to win, and if there's any way to do it, I want to know how to do it. But, he wasn't saying, and don't bring me any other conclusions. And I really remember reflecting, saying, I think I'm capable of, if there is a way to be successful, I think I'm capable of, working with this amazing group of people, of finding it and advocating for it. But am I capable of walking in there and saying, there's no steps we can take to change this trajectory? Fortunately, we didn't have to go there. But the president was pretty explicit about that, and I think that is out of the character that most people would expect, given some of the caricatures.
Yeah, what an incredible responsibility. Thanks. I'd like to open it up now to the floor, if anyone has questions for Peter and Meghan about their experience, about the making of this project. And I believe there's a microphone, and yeah, so the microphone will come right over, and we've got two gentlemen in the middle, so thanks, Brian. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you for that excellent, Thank you for that excellent analysis of the surge and the process that was used. Do you know whether a similar process was used at the time the decision was made to go into Iraq?
Neither of us were in the government at the time? And so that's a great question to ask our keynote speaker tonight at dinner, who is our friend and former boss, Steve Hadley. I do know that the administrations learn over time. And I remember when Steve took over for Condi, he said, there's some things we did well in the first term, and we need to build on that, and there's some process things that we did not do as well, and we need to refine our process to do that. And so that's in fact how my job got created at the NSC, was to do more of a certain kind of processing. So I suspect that all administrations grow over time.
I can say, having not been in the White House in 2003 or 2006, that this is something that does come up in the oral history volume. There are people reflecting on the learning process, so it is very much a part of the story.
And this is actually, I just realized Corey's paper devoted, Corey Shockey, who worked in the first term and then wrote one of the papers. And are you on a panel later on this afternoon?
Yes.
Well, I suspect this topic will come up because this is something she wrote about.
Great. Oh, yes, sir. Thanks.
Yes, it's really great to hear about the inner workings in the White House and what goes on behind the scenes. How did you get into that? I guess both of you. Was it sort of your academic career pushed you there, or something, you had a colleague there, or just luck you got in?
Part of a lottery. Yeah. So I came to the White House after being in the Bush administration for a couple of years previously. I joined the Bush administration right after 9/11 as part of a wave of people who joined government. I went over to work at the State Department, and I then volunteered to go with our military to Iraq as a civilian, so before the war, and ended up being in Iraq for the first 16 or 17 months. And when we transferred sovereignty to the Iraqis, it would have been normal that I would have gone back to the State Department. But at that point, I was offered a job by Condi Rice at the time, who was National Security Advisor, to come to the White House. So, and that was, I think, a reflection of the fact that Iraq was still a very difficult policy issue for the United States, that a lot of time and attention was being focused on it, that there were a lot of things that needed to be adjusted. And I had been there for quite a long time and had developed some key relationships with people and hopefully a pretty good understanding of the dynamics on the ground there. So there certainly was a big element of luck involved, but that was the path that got me to the White House.
I've just connected a dot just by asking that question and me sitting next to Meghan. So I did a little bit of work on the 2000 campaign for some of the foreign policy advisors to then Governor Bush. And in exchange, the guy I did most of the work for says, you get one bullet. Your bullet is an interview with Richard Haass, who is going to be incoming Director of Policy Planning. I flubbed the interview, and he hired Meghan instead. I just realized that you got the job. You got the job that I was not good enough to get. So I was, in the bleachers, in the cheap seats for the first term. In the second term, when Steve took over for Condi, he created this new office. And I vividly remember him saying this. He says he didn't say it, but I'm going to tell my version of the story. He's interviewing, and he says, I want an office of someone who will look at the big picture, and only an academic would be arrogant enough to work across all the issues that I want you to work on. And so he was looking for an academic who could pass political muster in the White House. Academics are not, we're not Bush's core constituency, and so I probably had an advantage in the interview, and I was able to come in at that point. But I did not know Steve until, I think the first time I met him was in the job interview. So it was something of a risk for him to hire me, although I had many other friends in the administration.
A somewhat technical question, and maybe better for the later panels, but I'm interested in how you make decisions and how the quality and accuracy of the intelligence that feeds the system affects the answer. And I know that you've painted a really surprisingly positive picture of the decision-making around the surge, and I'm aware that in the early stages, the Office of Special Plans was sort of set up to negate some of the stuff coming out of the intelligence community in general. So a general question about what you felt while you were there about the quality of intelligence and how important that was.
Sure. I know Peter has something he wants to say about this, but briefly, the intelligence was an integral part of our process. So we had the Director of National Intelligence, the Director of the CIA. I'm talking about the surge process now, not going back to 2003. And as not everybody always appreciates, intelligence is I always think about it as an input into the process, so that policymakers don't spend a huge amount of time focusing on, could this intelligence be right? Was this particular source considered to be accurate? These are all new questions that generally, the intelligence is an input into the process, and the policymaker's job is generally to determine, given the nature of the problem, what should we do about it? And so we used the intelligence community input in a variety of ways, and I can give you one example in which I think it was critical. One of the debates that was occurring in the surge process was, what would happen? Is it a viable strategy or approach, or part of a strategy, to turn over the responsibility for quelling sectarian violence to Iraqi forces? And in fact, if you remember, there was an Iraq study group that came out with a recommendation that was largely along those lines, and it had a certain appeal to people. Let the Iraqis deal with the sectarian violence, we'll deal with al-Qaeda, and we'll kind of have this division of labor. And so this was a serious proposal by many, and we investigated it, and we asked a number of different bodies to give us their assessment of what happens in that instance. Are the Iraqis strong enough to actually beat back the sectarian violence on their own without American or coalition assistance? And so we asked a whole variety of actors to give us their opinion, but I remember the intelligence community assessment on this was particularly important. Actually, all of the assessments, if my memory serves me correctly, all of the assessments said the Iraqis are completely incapable of taking this on their own, and we should expect, much larger scale sectarian violence if that is the direction we go. But we turned to the intelligence community for evaluations along those lines, which I remember to be very useful.
The one I remember that was the sharp point on what Meghan was describing was the question came down, what kind of leader was Maliki? Would he lead as a sectarian, divisive figure, or is that who he really was? Or was he just surrounded by people who were giving him bad information? Or was he just insecure in his position and he needed bolstering? And of course, that was an important unknown, but the viability of the surge depended in part on the bet you would make about who Maliki was. And of course, we asked the intelligence community to make their assessment, which they did, but it was not confident enough in the judgment. And the president sent Steve to personally meet with Maliki and take the measure of the man. And that was my first and only trip to Iraq. Meghan, of course, has been there many times. But the three of us went. And the purpose of that trip was for Steve to take an assessment of it. And I can tell you about this because his trip memo showed up in the New York Times a couple weeks later, and it was the scariest moment of my professional career because there were only like 3 or 4 people who had access to that memo, or so I thought. I knew I was one of them. I knew I hadn't leaked it, but I wasn't sure I could persuade anyone else that I was not the one who leaked it. Fortunately, the version that leaked was the one that had been distributed more widely. And so I live to fight another day. But if you read that memo, you can see Steve wrestling with this intelligence question. Who is Maliki, and what can we do to change the trajectory of the way he governs? And the success of the surge hinged on the president and Steve and others getting that right. And I think they did get it right. There's no question that Maliki, under the surge, governed Iraq more effectively in a way that better suited what the U.S. needed, what success needed. So Steve got the analysis right, but it was an intelligence question. And at the end of the day, as Meghan said, intelligence couldn't give us a guarantee that it would be one or the other. You had to take a bet. It wasn't a wild gamble, but it was a bet based on the best evidence that Steve had been able to gather.
This will be our second last question.
Hi, I'm Julie Branson. I worked for the Bush administration also the last 7 years, and I was at the Pentagon during the surge doing communications and was detailed to the White House at one point. And we were asked by the media for a lot of information that we couldn't give them, you know, sensitive or classified. And of course, they wrote stories anyway, jumped to conclusions, you know, came up with their own thoughts of what probably was going on. So I'm just wondering, looking back and at all the papers and historically, and you kind of piqued my interest with the historian, what role did what the media said play? Not that it would necessarily make you change your decision, but did you have to fight on another front, or, you know, how did that kind of affect the whole decision making and moving forward and being able to, you know?
Sure. I'm going to use this, well, very specifically, and this has been said about President Bush throughout the interviews, I think, and it's fairly well known, that the press, obviously we were all aware of the environment we were living in. Our families were reading the press, our friends were reading the press, but I think it was remarkable in the way that President Bush was not driven by the press. I cannot even remember a single day in the many years that I worked on this issue in the White House where I came in the office and had to respond to, you know, I had to respond to something that had been in the press, that I had to explain what so-and-so was talking about in the press. I mean, there were many mornings I came in and there were questions, but they generally related to something called the Iraq Night Note, which my office, Brett McGurk, who's here, and our team, we did for the president every night, which was not things in the press, but things, diplomatic reporting, intelligence reporting, and those types of things. So I don't feel like the media drove the people who were in the policy-making world in a very considerable way. But it obviously affected the overall environment in which we were trying to operate. And this allows me to make a point that I was hoping to make, which is about, I think one of the things that is useful in doing a project like this oral history is also to say, like, well, what didn't happen in this process that so often happens in other processes? And it is remarkable how little domestic politics intruded into these deliberations. You know, I have a specific memory very well. I can remember the president's face exactly. I was in the Oval Office, and it was during this time, and I forget what I said to him exactly, but it was something about the actual policy in Iraq, and then I made some comment about the politics and how it would play at home. And I remember he said to me, Meghan, stop. He's like, I don't need your political advice. He's like, just tell me what you think in terms of policy. The politics, that's my job. And, you know, he was very right about that. Nobody really needs my political advice. But so the domestic piece, I think, you know, it was incredible how little it intruded into our deliberations. You know, there were certainly conversations about this elsewhere, but it was not a big driver. Like, I certainly didn't feel the burden of putting forward something that was going to be domestically palatable. I knew that had to be true at the end of the day, but that wasn't part of my calculations and what we would put forward to Steve and to the president.
So I had a slightly different role than Meghan, and so I had more interactions, I think, with the arguments that were alive in the press, but also in the think tank community, sort of the public commentariat. And there was an office that worked for Karl Rove, whose job it was to listen to the critics of the administration who were maybe supporters of the president, but worried about this, that, and the other thing. And then that office would send me, hey, we're hearing that this is going wrong. What's the ground truth? And that particular office, Pete Wehner was the head of that office. He played an incredibly valuable role as the internal Team B asker of inconvenient questions. It's one thing if someone on CNN is shouting at the administration from afar. It's another thing if someone who has the unquestioned trust of the president and is loyal to the president, but asks the inconvenient question. And it was useful as a way of reflecting on how strong is our arguments. Can I persuade Pete on the merits of this or that? And if not, then I got to go back to Meghan and say, are we sure about this or that? And it was a way of improving the rigor of our analysis. And I can think of several occasions where outside critics were able to sharpen our analysis. But there are a couple other ways in which they reassured us, because we'd bring in the sharpest, most knowledgeable critics of the administration who were on TV, et cetera. They came and talked to us, and we realized, as they were telling us what they would do, that they did not have a better idea of what to do than what we were doing. That somewhat reassured us that we had considered all of the alternatives, that there wasn't a good idea that somehow, because of groupthink, we were not hearing. And so I found the press to be a more useful sounding board in that way, just intellectually. And the last thing I'll say is I know that there are some members of the press who had it in for the president and, were not fair. But many of the, what I'd say the A-team reporters who covered the White House, I think were trying to get the story accurately and trying to understand. And so I was, within the White House, one of those people who said, let's engage these folks, because I think they are trying to tell the story accurately. And so I don't really agree with President Trump's posture of they're the enemy of the people and you have to treat them as an enemy. I think that's a mistake. Most of the folks I interacted with and saw and read were trying to get it right.
I'm told we have a little bit more time, but I'm anxious of protecting your voices too. So maybe this will actually be the second last question. Sorry.
I'm curious about how difficult it was to work with the Pentagon to generate options for decisions that that many of the senior leadership within that organization may have opposed, and whether there was any concern when the president was seeming to lean towards a surge decision about the potential risks of being perceived of overruling the military advice that he had received maybe from his top advisors.
Well, I can't tell if Peter wants to jump in here first. I would say that there was a lot of care taken in this regard, that it was difficult to get options from the Pentagon. I won't deny that, particularly on questions about, what would it take if we did decide that the objective was to secure Baghdad? What would be required? So these kinds of questions, which may sound sort of hypothetical, but wanting to get a sense of, is it possible? Are the resources there? Because these are questions that people at the NSC and other places can't possibly answer. And in some regards, this is where we did look to get fidelity from our judgments from people outside of the Pentagon. But we did have a second sort of strategy review going on, the Bill Ludi look, and that was specifically done out of the NSC, and Steve Hadley may talk about that tonight, to ask the question of what kind of resources do we have. So I would say it was difficult. The point that I think is even more interesting was your second bit about what kind of care was given to managing this and the potential damage that could be done with the president making a decision that the military had gone against. And the president and Steve Hadley were, I think, very, very conscious of this and very conscious of the fact that to make a decision that the military didn't want to implement or their heart wasn't in implementing it was not going to be in anyone's interest. And so there is really, and this I don't think comes out in this project and hopefully will come out in subsequent projects and with the benefit of documents, there was really, I think, a very intensive effort to identify what are the issues that the military has with this approach and what might be done to mitigate those concerns, or are those concerns truly showstoppers? And so the two things that come to mind, first is just the strain on the force. And that was something that, of course, was a widespread concern and a very legitimate one. And you've read about or heard about the president going to the tank at the Pentagon on December 13th and being in a position to hear the concerns, to express his views, but also to be able to hold out, it's not an olive branch, but to be able to address some of those concerns by increasing the end strength of some of the forces. And so I think that was done in a way to acknowledge these are legitimate concerns that the military has about moving in this direction, and here are ways we can address them. The other one, which was even more critical in my mind, which doesn't get virtually any play at this point, was something that Peter alluded to, which was this question, is Maliki, the president or the prime minister of Iraq, is Maliki somebody that we want to bet on, that we want to put our confidence in? And the military had a very strong view on this. The answer was no. They had a view that his way of governing was overly sectarian, and there were very good reasons for that judgment. It had a lot to do with target sets that were given by the Maliki government to our military, which were almost exclusively Sunni. And so there was a long period of engagement where Steve engaged Maliki, where the president engaged Maliki over and over again on VTC, in person in Jordan, and other places. And the message was very clear that if America was going to make this commitment to Iraq, Maliki needed to make the commitment to treat everyone who broke the law the same, whether you're a Sunni, a Shia, or a Kurd. And this is very difficult for an Iraqi leader to do at that time, particularly an Iraqi leader who had been put into place by Muqtada al-Sadr, who was a Shia leader basically in charge of a group that was stoking violence on the Shia side. And so until we got that commitment from Maliki, I don't think our forces were going to have confidence in putting more force behind him. And so there's a lot of work that went into it. History shows, Maliki actually went before the Iraqi parliament and made virtually this statement, I'm going to treat everyone who breaks the law equally. And he did. To the point where he had to basically build a different political coalition because he lost the support of that Shia group because he started to arrest them. There was no halfway for Maliki. It was like, either you're going after these guys or you're not. And he made that shift. And then, and our military saw it immediately. But I think, that's an example of how that decision or this process wasn't only about making the decision. It was also about creating the circumstances in which that decision could be implemented successfully. And a lot of the skill of the president and Steve Hadley in bringing people along, not by convincing them or twisting their arms or threatening them or bulldozing them, but actually identifying concerns that were legitimate and ways in which those concerns could be mitigated.
So I was smiling because my friend and former colleague Hal Brands would have paid you $20 not to ask that question, because that is my personal hobby horse. My job on the NSC was to be a dilettante working on many issues where I had no academic bona fides. But on civil-military relations, that's something that I had actually did know something about. The only article I wrote while I was working at the NSC was an article for Sam Huntington's Festschrift, and I remember, Steve was like, "You're not going to write an article while you're working for me." I said, "Well, I have to do this. Well, it's going to cause political problems, et cetera." And then he read the article. He said, "That is so boring. No one's going to read it. Go ahead, you can publish it." But
You're giving them wrong ideas.
But I had a pre-commitment academic theory on how civil-military relations ought to go. And it was different from the way Sam Huntington thought it ought to go. And I was in press arguing that it should go this way and not that way. And then in the process of the surge, I remember trying to structure it to the extent I could in the direction that my own prior researcher said, this leads to better outcomes than that. And this is how you manage the flaws in Sam Huntington's approach. So I remember doing that, and what we ended up doing was something different. And it was exquisitely painful for me as an academic and practitioner of civil mill to see my theory semi not tested, semi found not wanting, and us doing it a different way and it going better than my argument would have said. The only consolation I had was that Sam's way was worse than mine, so that I was less wrong than my academic opponents were. But this was one of the key potential failure modes for the surge, especially I would say late December of '06, that one of the ways that the surge could have been stillborn is if it had, in reaching this decision, the president had inadvertently, or the team inadvertently created a civil military crisis where the senior military say, this is such a bad idea, we can no longer support it. And that, a key portion of the president's efforts during that phase of the decision, this is mid-December of 2006, was getting the rest of the team, the military part of the team, on the same page that he was arriving at, so that he could say on January 10th that all of his advisors agreed. That was not true in October. All of his advisors did not agree. It was true by January 10th. But it was a process to get everyone there, and the civil-military dynamic was a key bit of it. I remember showing Steve the final version. I'm going to throw you under the bus one last time. The final version of my article, which said, there's this academic version, it didn't work. There's this academic version, it didn't work. We did a hybrid. And Steve says, yeah, obviously. Academic models, that's not what you're going to do in a pragmatic, messy situation. I think we're fortunate that the president and Steve and Pete Pace, I would give a lot of credit to Pete Pace, and then incoming Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, they managed that process very effectively to avert what could have been a civ mill crisis.
We'll take one more.
You've mentioned a couple of times a little bit about the decision-making process and having had the ability to kind of see. You talked about how Bush was really knew what was going on, wanted to hear different opinions and things like that. You've also talked about you were getting opinions from a lot of places, from the intelligence community, from the defense, from academics, from non-academics, from policymakers, from people on the ground over there. So the question, if you can talk a little bit about it, is with getting so much of that information, how did you really go about sifting through that? And you had to distill this, present it to the president to make an argument. And how did you sift through that, like, this is legitimate concern, this is something, particularly with those things that you agreed with, but also with those things it's like, this is contrary to anything I've seen, is this something I bring up? How did you, so that's, I guess, really the sifting through that and figuring out what is really a concern, what's not. And you can talk a little bit about that process. That would be really interesting, I think.
Go first, and I'll try to be brief. So I think, again, this is a point that will be illuminated when documents come out. As people are well aware now, and it's captured in this project, there were a whole series of meetings that considered a variety of things that culminated in a very intensive series of National Security Council meetings with President Bush himself. Now, I think one of the things that will be obvious to people looking at the documents is in those meetings, we weren't having the same conversation about options from day one. Like, we did not begin with options. That we began And this is something that Peter really, I think, reinforced with me early on before this became a public effort, and it was really more of an internal effort. We began by looking at assumptions. We began by saying, like, what are the assumptions that we have made about Iraq and that we based our strategy on? And we kind of listed those, and it was a pretty shocking exercise, because when you list those, then we looked at them and we said, well, some of those might have once been true, but they're not true now. You know, like, what is the nature of the violence? What is the driver of violence? Is it the foreign occupiers in Iraq, or is it a sectarian dimension? So, you know, we did not begin that process by just starting at options, although there's always pressure in a situation where things are not going well. People want to know, what should we be doing? What are the options? What should we be doing? But I think that Steve and others gave us enough space to construct a process that actually started with assumptions and moved its way through. And you'll see in the documents that President Bush actually spent a lot of time hearing about different issues, different perspectives on different issues that were not about specific options, but they were predicates to getting there. And the one that I'll give you as an example, because it stands out in my mind as one of the most critical decisions he made before, you know, the big decision of the surge, is, and I remember this paper, so of papers that you're interested in seeing again, this is one of them, which is this question about, should the United States take responsibility for quelling sectarian violence in Iraq? And there were very, very strong views from his senior-most national security teams that we cannot take responsibility for this. This is not something that Americans can solve. This is not something we have the capacity to resolve. And I remember very distinctly those arguments that happened in an NSC setting, and the president making a decision saying, I know this is not going to be popular with everyone, but yes, we're going to assume some responsibility for this. So it was the fact that there were and the reason I find that so significant is because once he made that decision, it closed off some options. You know, it was a decision-making tree in some respects. And so once he made that decision, there were certain options that just were not consistent with that. So the reason I'm saying this and answering your questions is that the debates were not just about funneling everything into an options, you know, do we go home, do we stay, do we go bigger? It was a whole series of analysis that created a knowledge base upon which then the options could be debated. And so there was a lot of opportunity to feed in information from a variety of sources as we went.
So my answer allows me to link back to Tim's first question about the bridge between the academy and the policy world. I was one of the few people in government who could be fired and still feed his family the next day. I had tenure at Duke. And so that made me the most expendable member of the NSC staff. Because as the chief said, if you serve at the pleasure of the president, when the pleasure's gone, so are you. And I realized that meant that on some issues, I could be the person thrown into the mix to make an unpopular argument or mount a unpopular fight. And if I got crushed in the process, my family was still taken care of. And that came up twice. When one time with a very significant, powerful player who was arguing something that the NSC team thought was wrong, and I looked around the room and I realized I'm the one who's going to have to jump on this grenade and argue against it. The other time gets directly to the heart of your question, was with the state paper, and the state paper was powerfully argued. So it was a compelling story of how we could perhaps do something different. But what we on the NSC team did was, let's look at it as if this were a scholarly argument. What are the assumptions that are driving this? And we evaluated that the assumptions under which the state paper produced good outcomes, if those assumptions were true, let's plug those assumptions, those values, into the other options, and we realize that if those things are true, then the other options work even better. so that this proposal is dominated in a logical way by the alternatives. It was a very academic exercise that we did. And I think that carried the day, that along with the politics that the JCS said, hell no, we're not going to go along with that. And so that also helped carry the day. But the point was that kind of analysis that we try to teach our students how to do, they need that in government, particularly in thorny policy situations. It's not always the case that you're trying to assess what's the most popular thing, what's the easiest to sell. There is a basic piece of analysis that also needs to be done, and I think much of that comes out in the book, and hopefully even more of that will come out when the documents come out.
Well, it's been a wonderful day to start the event. I just want to say that when you think about this project and you think about the book and 28 interviews, you realize how much we relied on the generosity and goodwill of interviewees to take their time. And so for those of you who are here today who agreed to be interviewed, thank you so much for participating. And Meghan and Peter, you participated as interviewees, as interviewers, as a great resource as we developed questions. And I learned quite a lot from you. I know Peter said we needed to get interview questions to somebody by COB. And I had to Google what COB meant, because as a historian, you don't ever have any due dates that are real. So I found out how to do that by close of business. Okay, we got it done. Yeah, I learned an enormous amount from you. Our students will learn from you, and thanks so much for everything. Great, thank you.